pretty much everyone, and I'm talking including Western media and your most propagandized platforms like your BBCs and stuff of the world, are saying that America has lost this war.
They've not only failed in their objective of regime change, they've actually made it worse. So you could say a double defeat in that sense.
If they want to make a list of their war objectives and up to the top of their list is killing civilians, killing children, then yeah, give us that list and then we'll say you've achieved those, because that might as well go down in history as what you have achieved.
Iran's 10-point plan, if you read what's in the 10 points, the US and Israel would never have agreed to this prior to the war. So now that the fact that Iran has brought them to the table, in fact, to kind of make these workable, is a humiliating defeat for the US.
It's in the interest of the Americans to close this file and then address that fire that's brewing at home. The longer this continues, it's only going to make that fire bigger and bigger.
My kind of prediction is that the ceasefire will allow both of the sides to regroup, regenerate some of the weaponry, and in essence, I think it will go back to, I believe the war will continue after the 2 weeks. Iran winning, does that necessarily mean the Muslims are winning? Because Iran is a nation state. It's got a system that isn't Islamic in the sense that it's Wilayat al-Faqih. It's not a system that was established by the Prophet ﷺ. So should we really be supporting this? And just because they won, does that necessarily mean the Muslims won?
If they themselves can think that, oh, we want to spread democracy around the world because we think democracy is the best thing since sliced bread, even though they don't truly believe in it themselves, then why are we embarrassed about going, actually, we have a system that's going to save you from your Epsteins?
If you think about unity, as Rash mentioned already about the non-Muslims and the West, this war has exposed their disunity.
Before what's happened recently, everyone said, you can't take on a superpower. Everyone used to say that. And what Iran has demonstrated, in over a month is actually, yes, you can. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. You're listening to the Muslim Podcaster. I'm your host Majid, and today I'm joined by my co-hosts, Brother Rash and Brother JK. Assalamu alaikum, brothers, and welcome back to the show.
Wa alaikum salam. Pleasure.
I hope you guys are doing well.
Good, thanks. Yep. Good.
Alhamdulillah. We've got loads to talk about today, so let's get straight into it. As we know, everyone's talking about the Iran war. People's eyes are locked onto someone people didn't expect to, Pakistan. At this moment in time, people are looking towards these ceasefire talks to kind of see where this is going to lead to. But you know what? Everyone's talking about it. I think there's a certain angle which I want to tackle today, mainly. And I think personally, the bigger question for us is, what this actually means for the Muslim Ummah today in terms of what's happened in Iran. Let's not get straight into that because there's loads to discuss, especially since the last time we recorded this podcast. So let's start at the point of who has won the war, or if someone may argue, winning the war. So who do you guys think came out on top? Rash, I'll start with you, bro.
Jazakallah khair, bro. Yeah, I think you're right to frame it as winning rather than won, because like say, we can tell even with what's just happened in Lebanon that this is a continuing thing. It's not over. And generally, the surprising thing this time for me, in order to answer your question, is that it's not just some people saying this. Pretty much everyone, and I'm talking including Western media and your most propagandized platforms like your BBCs and stuff of the world, are saying that America has lost this war. They're saying that every single one, and this is BBC, and we always criticize BBC rightly for just how biased they are and just how much they toe the Western narrative. I read one of their articles and I was almost shocked to say they were going, every single one of America's military objectives have not been met. And then obviously your Al Jazeera's, your TRT Worlds and all the other platforms and commentators have said the same. America has not achieved its war objectives. They've tried to now turn the opening of the Hormuz Strait into a war objective, which, that wasn't an objective when it started. So if you're now celebrating that if you celebrate two things, which is replacing the Ayatollah with his son and opening up the strait, then wait there. your war objectives were a bit flawed from the beginning. So generally speaking, yeah. And if I just mention some of them, is obviously they wanted regime change. That hasn't happened. They wanted to completely prevent kind of nuclear weapons from being possible to be created, and they haven't removed that capability. Yes, they've destroyed navy and they've kind of destroyed a lot of the kind of the missile capabilities, ballistic capabilities. So they've created disruption. And if one of their objectives was killing children, which it is when it comes to the Zionist entity as well, then they've achieved that. If they want to make a list of their war objectives, and up to the top of their list is killing civilians, killing children, then yeah, give us that list, and then we'll say you've achieved those because that might as well go down in history as what you have achieved. But the things they said they were gonna try to achieve, they haven't. Simple as that. And on that basis, they are losing, and they're losing further because the whole dynamics of world geopolitics has been impacted. And I'll let JK and yourself add to that as well. But I think the greater loss will be seen in the longer term. In the short term, there's a lot of commentary about the fact that they haven't achieved their war objectives so far, certainly.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair, bro. I think that was a fantastic point you made about what they have achieved. If that was their priority, then you can say the destruction of civilians, destruction of civilian infrastructure, these have been achieved. However, like you said, Strait of Hormuz, everyone's saying, look, how can that be an objective if before the war it was open anyway? And now they're saying there's going to be a toll tax. So, in fact, that's not a win. And on top of that, if another win is we rescued our pilot, well, I mean, the whole story is dubious anyway. I'm sure you guys know. But nevertheless, it's not really a win because what was your pilot doing there anyway? So I think they're clutching at straws. But yeah, JK, what are you saying, my bro?
Yeah, I mean, you guys have said a lot of it, to be honest, in terms of the headlines. I think just to kind of add a little bit more, yeah, so the regime change that they talk about, yes, they got rid of the Ayatollah, but actually he's been replaced by a more hardline. His son is much more hardline in terms of they're more conservative. They are willing to fight. They're not. They're more. The previous Ayatollah was more in favor of diplomacy. So in that sense, they've not only failed in their objective of regime change, they've actually made it worse. So you could say a double defeat in that sense. And then when it comes to the nuclear program, that to kind of disarm Iran. In fact, we know that before the war, sorry, from in March, Iran were actually willing to end the stockpiling. Right, they were with the talks with Oman, they were agreeing to bring an end to the stockpiling, which is what you need in order to develop a nuclear weapon. So that's now not going to be the case. Iran's demands are that they can continue their uranium enrichment and stockpiling. So, in fact, they've lost on that as well. So, not only have they, what I'm trying to say is, not only have they failed in their war objectives, they've actually made it worse than what it was prior to the war. So, that's a double defeat in that sense, right? So, I think that they're the two things I want to add there. But also, if you look at Trump's a tweet, for, with the ceasefire, and that the 2 week ceasefire announced, he mentioned that Iran's 10-point plan was now workable. And Iran's 10-point plan is, if you read what's in the 10 points, and I'll just list a few, they are, the US and Israel would never have agreed to this prior to the war. So now that the fact that Iran has brought them to the table, in fact, to kind of make these workable, is a humiliating defeat for the US and a victory for Iran and the Ummah. And I'll talk a bit about why I'm saying and the Ummah maybe a bit later. But just to kind of name a few, right? In this 10-point plan, Iran have said they want to guarantee that Iran will not be attacked again, which is, that's already something that Israel won't want to agree to. A permanent end to the war, not just a ceasefire. End to Israeli strikes in Lebanon was included in the 10-point plan. So that's an interesting one, which I'm sure we'll talk about because obviously it's been bombarded massively after the ceasefire, a lifting of all US sanctions on Iran. You know, the fact that Iran is one of the heaviest sanctioned countries in the world, right? So the fact that they're asking for the sanctions to be lifted, and they can kind of get back within the economy, the world economy, is a big request in terms of that plan. End of all regional fighting with Iranian allies. Iran would open the Strait of Hormuz, and as you mentioned, they would impose a fee of 2 million per ship, which was not the case prior to the war starting. So they're actually gaining in one sense. And then they'd provide safe passage to through Hormuz, and they'd use the fees to reconstruct. But what I'm saying is, this is a humiliating defeat for the US, because when Trump was playing it large and talking about how he's going to defeat the Iran, and he's going to end the civilization, and all these unhinged tweets that we saw from him, or ex posts we saw from him, now have exposed him in the sense that he's shown to be a genocidal maniac with his counterpart Netanyahu, the American regime and the Israeli regime are part of that. But actually, when it comes to the 2 week ceasefire, which probably won't last, Iran have the upper hand. So I believe that Iran is winning the war, from in the sense of not militarily, because war can be defined as by the West. When the US are claiming victory, they're talking about the might and the aggression and the damage they've caused on Iran. But actually, that's not a sign of winning. That's just a sign of, as Rash was mentioning, your genocidal mentality that you have, where you're killing children and you're targeting schoolgirls. But actually, the real win is what it actually achieves, the outcomes of victory. And the Islamic lens we have on victory, defeat is not like, when I say defeat, sorry, the killing and the murder, and that's not necessarily defeat if it achieves a greater goal, which is, the protection of resources that belong to the Ummah, the fact that the regime hasn't fallen, even though it's not an Islamic regime. That's also, if it had fallen and became more pliant to the enemies, that would be a defeat for the Ummah, is what I'm saying. So there's many other things that you can bring into the victory, but just to keep it short, I think Iran has and is winning, and the US and Israel have been utterly humiliated, and given a really big bloody nose from this.
Subhanallah. I hear you guys, man, because to be honest with you, Rash may recall as well, we recorded a podcast when this had kicked off.
Yeah.
And at that time, to be honest with you, I think what we were saying is, look, if Iran can just survive this, it's a win. Whichever way you look at it, right? Whichever way you look at it, on a basic level, if you've ever played paintballing, right? I don't know if you guys have ever been paintball, right? And some of the games they have one game which is one person is defending their area and the other team is attacking, and they have a certain time. Now, it doesn't matter how many of the people defending get shot before the time runs out. What the key thing is, has the attacking team taken over, right, the defensive team, as in like taken over the area? If they haven't, even
Yeah.
if there's one person left in the defending side, the defending team would be seen as the winners. So even on a basic level, you'd say,
Yeah.
look, no matter how battered Iran was to get, if the main objectives of the US and the Zionists was not achieved, then it's a win for Iran. But some of the things that you
Yeah.
guys have been saying, it's unthinkable, because not only have they just survived, it seems like they're coming out on top. And to be honest with you, JK, when I saw those 10-point talks, those 10
Yeah.
points,
Points.
and the fact that the Americans are saying this can be workable, I was shocked myself, because I was thinking, that's when I was thinking, we can move on to the topic of the ceasefire, because I was thinking, you know what, this ceasefire thing doesn't sound genuine, because how can this be the starting point? Now, I know in business, both sides are going to come from an angle where they're going to ask for too much, and then they're going to negotiate, and they're going to agree on somewhere where they show that both sides have made concessions,
Compromised. Yeah.
compromised. But here, right, those 10 points, and one of them I don't think you didn't mention, but is on that list, was for the Americans to leave the
Yeah. Yeah.
the, the bases in the region. So it's mind-boggling, right? Mind-boggling. And maybe the Strait of Hormuz has a massive role in this because this is the one thing, the one pressure point it seems like the Iranians stay saved until the last moment because they never used it during the 12-day war, right?
No.
Because either maybe you know what, maybe they underestimated the power of this, strait themselves. Who knows, right? Or maybe they would have used it before. But in terms of the ceasefire, then, guys,
Can I just, Matt, just to add a
yeah,
couple of other little bits because then it will hopefully lead into that because it's still relevant to this section. I think, and this is not to take any credit away from Iran because they kind of had a big key role to play in what I'm about to say next, but just to take a little bit away in that sometimes, like you, even your example you gave about your paintballing, or in any example, it's not just about the two parties in terms of their strategy. Things like arrogance, I think, is a very important element to play here. America's arrogance, regardless of Iran's strategy, America's arrogance has had a distinct, it has been in play here, by the way, because them being so arrogant is what actually has resulted in some of these defeats that we're talking about. Because, like the fact that they wanted their NATO allies to come and help and they didn't. The fact that, the world, and this is where it's linked to Palestine and linked to the Gaza and linked to the genocide, the fact that public opinion over the last several years against US and Israel has been forming, and not just amongst the people, but also amongst some of these leaders, even the ones that we have no time for. There comes a point where a lot of them must have thought, wait there a minute, we're backing the wrong horse. And that in itself, America's arrogance and however they were kind of duped or decided to get into this by Israel and obviously their deep state and the Zionist influence within their camps and the Epstein files. And regardless, there's many elements, not just one. Their arrogance is actually what has caused them to go to this position where these 10 points, which you would never in your wildest dreams want to be as a starting point, is what has led them there. So sometimes we kind of go, like if someone's a pure Iranian supporter, they'll be like, yeah, Iran's playing like this 4D, 5D chess. They knew this was going to happen. They knew NATO was not going to come and help. They knew blah, blah, blah. That's not true. It's and that is propagandized the other way. But that's not to take away that Iran strategically knew that they had the Strait as a massive tool in this war. They knew that they're much bigger and they have an army bigger than the likes of Iraq, and they have partners in the region, and that they could potentially utilize the likes of China and that type of support. So that's not so. I'm not taking away from the fact that they use the cards that they have to their in their pack, but a US on the flip side thought it had certain cards in its pack, and then suddenly realized they didn't. And
Yeah.
that's why they found themselves in this situation, and they're in such a situation that look at the Lebanon thing and the ceasefire. That's why I think it nicely comes on to the ceasefire, is that it then comes to the point where they're now in a situation where they made this massive threat about destroying Iranian civilization, you know, kept extending this deadline, making them look like chumps each time. Oh, it's to Tuesday, it's 8 o'clock, it's 2 weeks, whatever. And every single time you extend your deadline, who did that make look like the stronger player?
Yeah.
Clearly, Iran's the one that's still going, if you're going to come and fight, come. Yeah. So that, and then the ceasefire being, like you say, leading on to that, last your question, sorry, but it was, I think that it encapsulate why we got to this position of ceasefire and why America, are in this losing or lost position, whatever we want to specify it as well as, it is humiliation, pure humiliation, as JK said.
Mm.
yeah, yeah, bro. To be honest, just to add to that, there's an interview I shared it on my channels by John Mearsheimer, where he's saying, look, Trump was told about the Strait of Hormuz, right? He goes, I don't care. Basically, he ignored it. He knew because look, this is America. Then at the end of the day, to think that they're not going to factor in something key like this, and John Mearsheimer was saying, look, he goes, it doesn't matter. The Iranians are not going to be able to do anything with the Strait of Hormuz because after we've hit them with our initial blow, they're going to be
Yeah,
finished. They won't have the
yeah.
capability.
I don't think they even expected their bases in the Gulf countries to be hit
They
because I
didn't.
don't think some people are not realizing just how big a deal that is.
Mm.
That's the equivalent of hitting American sovereign territory, by the way.
But you
You
know
know,
what,
when
Rash?
we,
I don't even think it's about they never expected that.
yeah,
Their plan was after that initial blow, there's not going to be anything left to do that. It would have
Yeah.
been part of the war games, but this is the arrogance. This is why I mentioned this because of the point you made about the arrogance.
Okay.
They truly believed, and maybe the Venezuela model played on their minds. They truly believed, and the intel that they had, if they take out the main man, Ayatollah. They take out the main leaders. At the same time, you got the people brewing on the ground. You got their sleeper cells. You got Mossad on the ground. That they felt, and you can see this is clear now. That they felt that initial blow.
yeah,
After that, these guys will not be able to recover in order to do anything. So I think
Mhm.
they knew about the bases, the threat on them. I think they knew about Strait of Hormuz. But miscalculation, and I think that miscalculation, you made a fantastic point. And
the
once you,
arrogance.
it's arrogance, and it reminds me of Pharaoh, right? That same level of arrogance. And what we're finding out now is the way the Iranian model is set up is, it's kind of split between 31 provinces,
Yeah,
right? Where if one, because normally what we see is you take out the top, everything crumbles. But these guys, the way they set it up is, if one province goes, don't worry, you still got 30. Five go, you still got X amount, until you got one left, right? And maybe then it can regenerate. So it's a bit of a sick model, if I'm honest with you. But so yeah, just on that point about the arrogance, I think
Yeah.
that's very clear now. And they're having to drink from that same cup, or as they say, they're having to sleep in the bed they made, or, there's
yeah.
some sort of saying
Yeah.
like this, right? But listen, ceasefire, guys. Um, I don't know, man. Just want to get your thoughts on it in terms of what you think about the ceasefire and whether it's even worth discussing at this point. Whether this is a time buying exercise, whether it's something which the Americans are using in order to recalibrate, restock, and go again. From what I've seen, analysts around the world are actually saying, no, no, this is actually genuine, and they point towards the Strait of Hormuz as being the one key factor as why the Americans do actually want to get this dealt with through this ceasefire, right? But what's your thoughts, JK? I'll start with you.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very fragile ceasefire in that arguably already it has been broken in the sense that Israel is bombarding Lebanon. That even I think like a couple of days ago um, I think hundreds of bombs were they attacked Lebanon with hundreds of bombs in 10 minutes, killing 200, 300 people. So Lebanon has been bombarded, innocent civilians are being killed, many thousands being injured. So, in fact, you could argue that the ceasefire has already, in essence, broken because there's this debate around Iran believing Lebanon was part of the ceasefire and Israel and America saying it wasn't. So it's very fragile. The other thing is it's a 2 week ceasefire. 2 weeks is not a long time. This isn't a permanent ceasefire, but by any stretch, it's a clearly a temporary ceasefire, and hence why your question about what what is the underlying reason and agenda behind the ceasefire, especially with this, as you said, the 10 points seem very unworkable actually, if you look at what they are. So, is it a little bit of a ploy to stop Iran? Open up the Strait of Hormuz because of the impact it's having on the global economy, a massive impact on the global economy. So I believe it is. I believe it's a little bit of a ploy for them to kind of recalibrate, regenerate as well, because they have been attacked. The Patriot systems and stuff have been attacked, so that they can regenerate and think a bit about how they want to go forward with this war. But I believe that it will continue the war after either after the 2 weeks or prior to the ceasefire. Like it'll end, and and fighting will begin again. Is my honest opinion because of how fragile it is. That's my thoughts on the ceasefire. The thing
But,
about the Strait of
but
Gone.
based on what you said there, what are you basing that on? In the sense, like, think about what we've just discussed. It would seem like it's in America's interest really to kind of like
Yeah,
cut the losses, show that they won it. I mean, Trump also says that from day one anyway, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And we know whose interest it isn't in. But do you think there's goodwill from the Americans? Not goodwill, but do you think
But yeah,
they
yeah.
really want to deal with this, but then it may get sabotaged and it will last? Or do you
So
think from the Americans' point of view, it's something which is a diversion from the start?
I think it was in essence a bit of an off ramp for America and the Zionists, or mainly America, because they also realize that they're losing the war. They're losing from a not again. It's not to do with might and aggression. They've employed more might and aggression on Iran, and Tehran has been massively hit. So I don't think you can't argue that they haven't been. Their infrastructure, civilians have been killed. They have been hit, right, and they have been weakened. However, I think the US were looking for a way, and I think that's why they used Pakistan, which is an interesting one. Where, the claim is that Shabazz Sharif, and who's it? Asim Munir is it the second man, who Trump thanked, right? But actually, if you look into it a little bit, there's also claims that the ex post that Shabazz Sharif wrote. If you look at the drafting, it was actually, you could argue it was written by the US because of some of the wording around Pakistan PM draft, and it doesn't seem like an internal post, right? And I believe that in essence they used Pakistan in this to claim that, oh look, there's a mediatory, they're mediating here, for a ceasefire, and we've accepted it and all of this, and you could tell Trump was using that. So I think in essence it applied it was a bit of a get out, for the US and Israel from this losing war. So I think they wanted it, and it's more in favor of the US. I believe if Iran said no to it and continued, I think that may have been better in a way for Iran. However, you also have to think about the civilian casualties, so they may have wanted that to end as well. But from the position they were in terms of using the Strait of Hormuz to bring a stranglehold to the global economy, that was never, I don't even think Iran expected that. So I think that's a very useful card for Iran and the Ummah to have. But I think the ceasefire will essentially, my kind of prediction is that the ceasefire will allow either both of the sides to regroup, calibrate, regenerate some of the weaponry. And in essence, I think it will go back to. I believe the war will continue after the 2 weeks, just because I don't. Negotiation needs to happen after that, right? Iran is not willing just to stop now. Iran wants these demands to be met. And yes, they may make some compromise, but it's so far. As you said, usually it's kind of here and you compromise a bit here, but it's so far. So I can't see it. I can't see either side agreeing to it, to be fair. Both sides. I don't think US and Israel agree to a lot of these demands, and I don't think Iran will agree to US demands and Israeli demands, right? So therefore, what does that mean? Then, the fighting will, unfortunately, in a way, recommence. So, um, yeah.
You know what? A lot of people who kind of commentate on wars, people who have like done history, studied every single war that has ever happened in history. You get people who are like scholars in battles, and a lot of them say that thing with war is you might have heard the term war is unpredictable. Yeah, you go into a war with obviously a set of objectives, but things happen that are well outside of what your predictive models are. Why this is why they have these
Mm.
war games and they try and evaluate every situation. But I think what clearly this one describes is similar to many other wars in the past, that you might just assume, oh, that they're the bigger, like the Russia versus Ukraine or whatever, that, you make a certain prediction, but there are elements that you don't take into consideration. And that's why I
Mm.
agree with where JK is coming from in that what they've got to now, because they, like I say, to be fair, they're both looking for a way out. It's not like Iran are just going, yeah, because we're winning, we're going to carry on and we'll let the destruction continue. If America starts to hit a few power plants and a few bridges and things like that, yes, okay, those are things that can be rebuilt, but you're putting a country back decades and decades and decades. So it'd be stupid of Iran just to go, no, you guys carry on bombing, but because we've got these strategic ways to still come out on top, we'll carry on. So that's one element, which is why I think there has to be some kind of agreement. But as JK is saying, those terms are so far out that America are now in a position where it will only be them and their administration that will say they have victory. Every single other person will say, if you give in to, if you take the sanctions away, certainly, and you allow the Strait to be told when there wasn't a toll before, then no one in the world is going to say that's any type of victory for you. So those
Mm.
things are important. But the reason why I believe is what's happening in the background and what a lot of people are saying is a lot of countries are going to Iran and having private discussions with them now. It's changed the dynamics of the world where countries are going, like I said earlier, we can't trust America, we certainly can't trust Israel. So where we thought that we had some strategic kind of protection from them, we need to make sure we have independent protection now. So they're looking at Europe, they're looking at China, they're looking at Russia, they're looking at their own militaries. It's had a massive dynamic shift on how people are viewing the world and geopolitics at large. So discussions are happening in the background. I suspect, and this is just a hunch, I suspect Iran looked at it and went, it's the right time to agree to something because countries are coming to us behind the scenes and going, we'll make these deals with you going forward. You're going to let our ships through because we have these deals with you. So there's stuff in the back. Not everything's out in the open. There will be
Yeah.
discussions going on in the background. And I think Israel is probably aware of some of that, which is why at every opportunity, and they have done in the past, every time there's negotiations, flipping Israel tries to kill the negotiators. And
Yeah.
not just
Yeah.
Israel, obviously, elements of the American regime as well. But I think there's stuff going on in the background, and that the reason why I started my point with the war is unpredictable. I think it's got to that point where all sides are looking at it and going, "You can't turn back time now." So we
Exactly. Yeah.
need to somehow find a solution from the situation we've got, and that has put Iran in a better situation, and it puts America in the worst possible situation because there is no going back.
Mhm.
To just to finish, and even things like, I don't know how much you guys think this is linked, but so it's a bit of a question, really. You've now got China and Taiwan talking. You've now got South Korea and
Mhm.
North Korea talking. And remember, some of this is linked because South Korea had the THAAD missile defense system, and America took it and put it in Jordan to protect Israel.
Mhm. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Taiwan and China with everything that's going on. And if you look into what's happening with semiconductors and you look into what's happening with AI and the direction of travel of AI and the need for compute, then there's a lot of other pieces of the jigsaw that has almost been accelerated. I'm not saying it's directly gone that because of this, then this.
Yeah. It's become
But
more significant and more important quite quickly.
yeah, because a lot of
Yeah.
people are going, wait there a minute. The global world order was a certain way, and you could almost rest on your laurels a little bit
Mm.
and let things, take your time,
Play out. Yeah.
play out. Yeah. Whereas now everybody's going, you know what? We can't just let things play out. We've got to
Yeah.
take the lead because we don't trust the international law. We don't
Yeah.
trust that if one country does something against international law, that the UN or the international community or the NATO or whatever is going to come out in our defense. None of
Exactly.
what they set up as being ways to keep the post-Westphalian order, intact. It's all been destroyed in a few years.
Yeah, yeah. I agree. I think one major thing that's come out of this war is the move away from kind of unipolar world to a multipolar world in terms of geopolitics. That the US isn't as strong as it used to be. And the status of yes, they are the superpower, but their status of superpower in terms of when they used to demand something and it just happened, and when they told their allies to do something, they just did it. They said jump and they said how high. That is not the case anymore. And this war really played out. The NATO allies didn't come to Trump's aid and the US's aid, and the Gulf allies are questioning their, whilst they are still agents, they are absolutely questioning what is the value of having these US bases if it becomes a threat to our country and threat to us, our populations. So these are all being questioned as well. Yes, they've been exposed for their treachery, but yeah, they're questioning that. But I think going back to your first point you made, there is something about in war and in life really that quit while you're winning. Like there's a point that if Iran carried on, they would start losing their own allies or those who are neutral towards them, because it was affecting not only the US, right? It wasn't just affecting the
Good
US and
point.
Israel. It was impacting the whole world,
Yeah.
global economy, populations. That there's been reports of potential starvation due to some of the impact of the strait being closed and the global economy. Yes, so we're impacted. Our petrol prices have gone higher, inflation's going higher, but we can still live. But actually, when populations are dependent and they're on the brink, then Iran will slowly, if they carry on too long, they start becoming, people start looking at them as the main sticking point. So I don't think Iran want that either. And that's why they've come out and even said to their Gulf allies, if you want to call it, that look, we're not trying to target you. We are targeting the bases, indirectly you as well, in the sense that why are you hosting these bases? But it's in essence they don't want these relationships to completely break down, because that will isolate Iran, and they don't want that. So I think you make a really good point in terms of timing
Mm.
with the ceasefire, but we'll see what happens going forward.
I think with the ceasefire also, just on what you guys are saying as well, I think with Iran, it's important that they are shown as the reasonable people in this whole thing, because even if you think about it, with the attacks in Lebanon, I think the Zionists would have been hoping that the Iranians now do something, because ultimately, Hezbollah joined the war um, on the side of Iran, and can Iran actually abandon Hezbollah, right? But from what we can see, what's happened is the Iranians have thought, you know what, Hezbollah, don't worry, you keep doing what you're doing, right? Let's see how this plays out, because the Pakistanis are coming out and saying, look, this was part of the deal. I've even heard an American who's saying, yeah, it was part of the deal, but then when the Israelis and the Americans discussed this, because the Zionists were really cheesed off because they weren't involved, right? And then it kind of changed. However, had now just say Iran responded, it would have shown actually, you know what, they broke the ceasefire, right? Because for the world, for especially the Western world, the think about the ceasefire that the Zionists broke the Hezbollah every single day. Has anyone ever said they've broken the ceasefire? And when Hezbollah strikes back, what do they say? Hezbollah is bombing northern Israel. So from the Iranian point of view, it's like, okay, look, let's play the game as well. Let's see how this goes forward. Let's bring these terms to the table. I think from their side is genuine, because they find themselves in a stronger position, and it's like, look, even if three of these 10 get accepted, we see that as a big win. Originally, we thought surviving was a big win, but actually, we may come out of this even better, right? Whilst the Americans, look, I think there's the midterms, there's the world economy, there's the bad press. I think the Americans would like this to come to a close where they can actually proclaim that they achieved something. So maybe in the negotiations, the Iranians are going to give them a bit of like space to say, sometimes you do this, like just say you have an issue and you think, you know what, I can't totally humiliate this guy because then he's never going to go. So let me give him a face saving exercise so at least this can come to an end.
Mm.
Um,
Magic, but just to add quickly, the situation in America is hot right now. I don't know, the whole Melania Trump coming out and talking about the Epstein stuff, with then America, with Trump now calling out Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and all of these people. Yeah, the situation is hot over there. It's not just a case of, the previous superpower of the world in control, being able to strategize and, do whatever it likes. There's I don't know if you think it's a stretch that is leading towards civil war over there, because the clash between the elites and the people is is brewing. If you look at it, why would the actual president of America need to write posts about people who are on, YouTube channels and whatever having an influence because they're having a massive influence. Why did
Mm.
you do you think they had to take out Charlie Kirk? Why do you think they had to control Turning Point USA?
Mm.
Because the people on the ground, why did they have to buy TikTok?
I think what it is doing, if I'm honest with you, I think they are getting ready to a stage for JD Vance to
Mm.
replace Trump personally.
Mm.
Because you look at how this guy's been behaving since this Iran stuff happened and a bit recently.
Yeah,
He's been quiet. He's
he's been
been trying to,
backpack.
and then now what they're saying now as well in the room when they were having the discussion, shall we attack? He was the one who
The
said
only
it's
one
not a
that
good
said no, yeah.
idea, right? So I think some things there's been a shift because look, someone has to be the fall guy. They can't say the whole MAGA things comes to an end. If it does, then it will be civil war, like you're
Yeah.
saying, Rash, right? But if it's one failed statesman who's probably gone bit old, he's gone longer than he should have, he's lost it a bit.
Mm.
That's different because the whole thing still moves forward. Because look, America still, look, this is not for this podcast, but there is a view out there that everything's happening is actually happening in line with the master plan that the Americans are pushing in order to fortify the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, right, at a stage where the world will be dependent on them for resources. Okay, some people are saying it's a stretch, but nevertheless, what I'm saying, there are these discussions
Yeah.
that are happening. But you're right, that things are brewing. It's not easy, but the quickest and easiest way then is, and this is what I'm saying, a bit opposed to what JK is saying, it's in the interest of the Americans to close this file
Yeah.
and then address that fire that's brewing at home. The longer this continues, if they send boots on the ground or whatever, because I mean that's probably the next natural step, right? It's
Mm.
only going to make that fire bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
Whether the Zionists will allow that to happen, I'm not sure. But listen, we've discussed a lot of what's happened or what's happening, right? But I think the real discussion in my mind is that where does this leave the ummah in terms of Muslims? Right, we're seeing these geopolitics happening. We're seeing that China's being benefit from this, Russia's benefiting, but from the perspective and the aspect of the Muslim world. So, my first question to you guys is, and I think this is worth discussing, what does this war actually reveal about the current state of the Muslim world? JK, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it's a really important discussion because often we can talk about Iran and the US, and when we talk about the outcome or the fallout of the war, it's not just, as I said, it's not just an impact on Iran or the US and Israel. It's an impact on the world as well as the Ummah. And when I've been speaking about the so-called victory or who's winning, there could be an argument to say, well, how can you say that, Iran winning, does that necessarily mean the Muslims are winning? Because Iran is a nation state. It's got a system that isn't Islamic in the sense that it's Wilayat al-Faqih. It's not a system that was established by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, should we really be supporting this? And just because they won, does that necessarily mean the Muslims won, right? There's this debate, but I think the lens we need to apply is that Iran is a Muslim country. It's Muslim land. It was under the Islamic civilization. Um, the resources of Iran belong to the Ummah. Its capability aid the Ummah. Whether it's being used for national interest, that's kind of a separate debate. But the annihilation or the destruction of its arsenal and its ballistic program and its nuclear enrichment program is not only a defeat for Iran if that happened, but it would be a defeat for the Ummah because we'd lose that capacity and capability. So this is the lens we need to apply. That therefore, in order to protect that and able to continue with that capability, is a win for the Muslims. And this goes to your question. In the longer term, what it means for the Muslims and the Ummah is that we do have that capability capacity, and if we can protect it, then in essence it will be an aid for the Ummah when that eventual ultimate victory occurs, where Islam rises and it has that capacity, right? So I think that's my take on what it really means for the Ummah. I think there's other bits to kind of bring in. So if you think about unity, as Rash mentioned already about the non-Muslims and the West, this war has exposed their disunity in that they didn't come together. The NATO allies refused and have been called out by Trump in terms of he's even called out Keir Starmer and Macron and the Europeans for not pulling their weight. And it really highlights that they are disunited, even though they have clear, aims against the Muslims. When it comes to their strategy, they're disunited, and that's like been exposed, right? Which is great for the Ummah to see them disunited. But then on the counter side, whilst they have spent millions and over years, they've been pushing the flames of sectarianism among the Ummah, that you're Sunni, you're Shia, you're Kurd, you know, they have pushed it since the Sykes-Picot Agreement. They've been pushing division. What have we seen? That en masse the Muslims supported Iran and have been supporting Iran in this war en masse, regardless of our differences, regardless of our theological differences with them being Shia and we being Sunni. You've seen en masse. I'm not saying every Muslim because we know there are pockets who are against them and they want the defeat of Iran. But en masse, I would argue that the Muslims have united and put aside their differences because they see that Iran winning in this war is greater for the Muslims, and they are, the US and the Zionists are a greater threat to the Muslims, and they need to be defeated. So I think that's one of the things that has shown for the Ummah. And the other thing, and I'll let Rash come in, that I think it's massively highlighted and amazing, actually, something that, again, I don't think it was planned, but actually it's potentially the sunnah of Allah, like this has been highlighted and exposed to us, is the strategic strength of these straits and maritime chokeholds that the Muslims have control over. So Iran demonstrated it with the Strait of Hormuz, in that this strait is accountable for 25% of oil trade. And it has a greater impact on imports and exports of goods and oil and energy, right? It has a massive impact. Well, as we've seen, just disrupting it slightly has caused a massive global economic meltdown. So what does that highlight? That we, the Iranians and the Muslims, have control over this strait and can use it for their influence and aid when it needs to. And this is just with the Strait of Hormuz. But now, and I'd looked into it, like what other straits and maritime chokeholds that are there, and who has control over them? You have Bab el-Mandeb, as we know, that is close to Yemen, that the Houthis don't control, but they have the ability to disrupt and use it in the aid of the Muslims. And again, this is a key strait that oil and energy and goods go through. Then you have the Suez Canal, which is not a natural strait, but is a man-made strait controlled by who? Egypt. And we show that, okay, the regime may not be using it in the way it needs to, and the regime may not be in aid of Islam and Muslims, but in essence, it's under Muslim control. Then you have the Strait of Malacca, which is controlled by Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. So the majority of that is Muslim nations who own this. And again, 25% of oil and goods go through this strait. So again, a massive geostrategic location and strait that the Muslims have control over. And you have the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Strait controlled by Turkey, the Muslims again. I'm not saying that these nations are using it to aid the Muslims, but what I'm saying is that these straits are in control of the Muslim Ummah. So we have influence and ability to use these to bring an entire global economy and a global system to a standstill just by using one of these straits. So is that not a massive fallout in aid of the Ummah and the Muslims that has come out of this war? I think it is. So these are some of the couple of points that I think really the war has exposed and highlighted. And I think the real thing will be, how does the Muslims and the Ummah use these? How do we put pressure on the governments and ensure that the governments represent us and use these to aid the Muslims and cause victory for the Muslims and Islam, rather than using it to aid the enemies and being agents to them and following what they want? we should be using this to aid to aid us and aid the Muslim Ummah.
Yeah, that's
Couple of points from me, yeah.
yeah, no, no, really good points. There's some stuff to come back on, but let's go Rash first, and then I'll
Yeah,
share my thoughts.
I found that really insightful. Really, I think they're really good points. I think just to add to it as well, it goes back to my point about you can't turn back time. The industrialization, the industrial revolution, the industrialization of the world, the interconnectedness of the world today in itself is what has actually strengthened those channels for us. What you're describing, JK. Like back in the day, well, a long time ago, countries and civilizations were more, what's the best word? They're self-dependent. Your energy requirements, your food requirements, your whatever were kind of you
Controlled by
control
you.
you yeah within your borders, because that dependency before, like, the modern nation state kind of model, where some countries produce certain things, other countries don't. UK, for example, is in a bad situation in that it's now a service-led industry, so it doesn't really provide anything as such to the rest of the world, other than, like, say, okay, financial services and stuff. But if the financial services market crashes, and the current way the financial model of the world works was to change, that has an impact on the UK. So can you see how each country has its niches now? So what you're describing, I think, such a fantastic point, is that now these straits and these places of influence has more of an effect on international economy and the way the world, one thing happening in like thousands and thousands of miles away affects everybody in the world. Whereas I
Yeah,
think, and someone might correct me if I'm wrong, is that that certainly wasn't the case hundreds of years ago.
no, no, it
So
wasn't.
I think that's a really good point, and that links to the what Muslims need to see, that should be motivating for the Muslims, in that maybe that for a long time, especially while this genocide's been going on, we've been sitting on our hands a little bit and thinking they can just kill our people at will, and we can't do anything about it. It is a bit of a dig at Iran, in that, you could have closed that straight as soon as the genocide started and caused a major headache for the people who supported the genocide, the Western powers. But you didn't. You waited
Mm,
until the war came to your borders. Same with
mm,
every one of the other straits that you've mentioned. Yes, the Muslims have come out on the streets and they deserve credit for that. And, we all wanted the end of the bloodshed, and we all want the liberation of Palestine. But the fact that most people don't act until it comes to their door, that's a problem.
yeah, I think the only outlier is Bab el Mandeb. The
Yeah,
Houthis did use that.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and equally, that's also not too much of a criticism, in that, like you say, maybe they didn't fully foresee just how powerful
Yeah.
they could, how much of an effect this could have, and maybe it needed to play out a little bit for the world's public opinion to brew to the level it has in their hatred of the Zionist entity. Yeah,
But
so go
yeah,
ahead.
go on, Rash, and
Yeah,
finish.
and then just to come back to your point, yeah, from an Islamic standpoint, I think we do need to take lessons from it rather than take credit for it, because I don't think we can. The credit comes from the fact that, we want change, but maybe we don't know how to instigate that change. People want a resolution, but I think what we need to take away from what's happened here is that exactly what JK is saying, is that we have the capability, and we can extend that to the number of people we have in our armies. We can extend that to the fact that, the people who are kind of created some of these systems, there are Muslims involved in some of the organizations. We have the faculty of coming up with these ideas of producing defenses and weaponry and all of these kind of stuff. That's not just reserved for the Western powers. But I think it's, if for too long we've kind of gone, well, the world superpower is America, and that can't change. I think this whole episode has shaken that up.
No, I agree with what you guys are saying. The actual, I think the question could have been the answer you've given, I think you've interpreted the question in a certain way, and I think it's true because I think we've been pointing out these advantages and these materialistic benefits that the Ummah has. Okay, I think this is something that's really, really important because before what's happened recently, um, everyone said, you can't take on a superpower. Everyone used to say that. And what Iran has demonstrated, in over a month is actually, yes, you can, right? But from the I was thinking more from the intellectual level of the Ummah today, in terms of, yes, we may have all these resources and these materialistic advantages to our in our arsenal, right? However, if the Ummah itself isn't going to make any changes so that it can utilize these, then it's actually no point really in having these, because when the Iranians used it, they used it for their own
Mm.
interests, right? Because we can see that, look, as Muslims, we can see as an ummah, we're always reacting rather than shaping events. It's other entities, it's other players who are shaping the events, and we either the fodder, right? We're either the ammunition for someone else, or we're used by someone else to achieve something, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You understand what I'm trying to say? So, whether this is a leadership issue, whether the problem is deeper than that, because I think we need to think about is what actually needs to change after what we've seen, what we're witnessing now. What actually needs to change within the ummah in order to then be able to, stamp its authority on the world, which it can do because it has resources. It will actually hold the world economy to ransom, right? But before that, there's interesting changes that need to be made. And one last quick point is, I was watching this video yesterday, and it was talking about how the Strait of Hormuz, right? Hormuz was actually the general or the governor. That was his name, of the
Mm.
Persian general governor of that area, where basically he used to look after that waterway in terms of stuff coming in and leaving the assassinate of the Persian Empire, right? And it was Khalid ibn al-Walid who dealt with him because he sent him a letter, Hormuz, accept Islam, or the normal conditions. And this got this guy so angry. He said, "Where's Khalid?" Right? And then they met on the battlefield, and obviously Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu proper finished him off, yeah.
Wow.
And then they went on to win, and they conquered the rest of Persia. So even that Strait of Hormuz, it's Hormuz is a guy, but it shows in the past when the Muslims were able to actually take over this land for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then use it for the ummah, for the betterment of the ummah, right? But right now we can
Yeah.
have Hormuz, we can have Dardanelles, we can have all these places, but we're still lagging, and I think that's the state of the Muslim world I'm kind of referring to.
Yeah, yeah. So I agree. I think that's probably the next step in that Iran has demonstrated how these things can be used. Whether they used it for the Ummah or their national interest, most likely their national interest to protect themselves, right? Because as Rash said, only when the war came to them, they used it. But I think what it did highlight to the Muslims is that, look, these do have a massive influence, even though we are not as mighty and as great as the US empire and the Zionists being supported by the Western Empire, right? We're not, in terms of resources and we're not at that level. However, we have a sufficient amount to be able to use what we do have to cause a disruption. So I think one is around the unity point, that we need to move away from looking at things in a nationalistic way. That Iran has its own national interest and it protects itself. Turkey has its own power and capacity and capability, uses it for itself. Pakistan has its own. No, these all need to be equalized. Just give me 1 minute. Sorry.
What, can I
Sorry.
just add? I'm just going to add something there. Do you reckon there's an element of human nature involved here, though? Definitely. Well, not do you reckon?
Definitely, yeah, yeah.
Obviously, there's human nature. The issue that is, and we talk about how people have interests, don't they? At the end of the day, and what bonds us is our various interests. The issue sometimes is, and what we're seeing played out on the international stage, is that the human nature element is being played out. If you're not at threat, you kind of get the status
Yeah,
quo is
absolutely.
easy. The status quo is always easy. So yes, there's a part, and I completely appreciate where your question is, Madge, because what, like you say, we're just constantly being played, and
Reacting, yeah.
we're reacting, very reactionary. But that I think part of that is human nature. When you're comfortable, when the status quo is the status quo. Even look at Iran. Sanctions for what, 50 something years, yet the sanctions in themselves, what they achieved, they've achieved a nation who thought about themselves from a defensive point of view. How do we carry on existing in spite of these sanctions?
Yeah.
It didn't lead necessarily, even though it possibly could have done to, the only way we really go on the offensive is to actually strategize that way rather than strategizing defensively. In the same way as saying with all these other countries, they're all just looking at it from how do we maintain our status quo? How do we maintain our existing borders? Which is why this is the probably a discussion to go further, is that the reason they hate Islam, the reason they have a problem with Islam, they know if the Muslims truly appreciated what Islam is expansionary, but in the way of spreading justice, in the way of spreading the rules that will allow people to live according to their creator's design. They look at that and they take one bit of that. Oh, they're expansionary. So when they then become expansionary in order to prevent Islam becoming expansionary. But we sometimes go on the defensive and go, no, 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 no. Look, we're happy with our nation state borders. We don't want to attack anybody. Let us live in our status quo kind of bubble. And I think that's the mentality that is to our detriment. If they themselves can think that, oh, we want to spread democracy around the world because we think democracy is the best thing since sliced bread, even though they don't truly believe in it themselves, then why are we embarrassed about going, actually, we have a system that's going to save you from your Epsteins? We
Yeah.
have a system that is going to save you from the ills of alcoholism, the ills of what is it, OnlyFans, and the ills of gambling and all of this. We have a system that saves you from that. You're just scared of Islam because it's not what you believe in. But actually, Islam has a mechanism to help you with all of those things. Our issues, we're even ourselves as Muslims, as nations, we're comfortable with our status quo and being on the defensive, being on the reactionary. Whereas we should be the ones that go, if you can come forward with your despicable values and try to spread them across the globe with your despicable people, and this is not applying to everybody, by the way. I'm talking about the elite class here, clearly. Then why are you so afraid of people who actually now you're realizing much of your hatred towards Islam has been fueled by propaganda by those same elites that are raping children? Who do you believe? And I think this is really important. And maybe that is more of maybe where you're heading with your question, Madge, is that we as an ummah need to appreciate that we can't always just be thinking defensive. And what's happened now maybe should give us the motivation to go, wait there a minute, just because we're saying that we've won in this particular conflict and with this particular war, and they've been humiliated. If we just now sit back down on our hands and go, we won this time, that we'll lose the next time.
Yeah. No, no, of
Yeah.
course, bro. And I think the question was leading towards what sort of lessons we can take from what we've witnessed, and some of the things that you guys have already mentioned, capability. We already knew we have capability, but not being tested against the superpower of the world. We've demonstrated that. We've demonstrated, like you said, fantastic point, that the kuffar, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that, they hide behind, high walls, but they actually disunited, right? This time the walls were taken down, and we saw that disunity in public. Why? Because one side's interest didn't match the other side's interest, right? We saw this. And even though there have been some players on the scene that are being promoting this thing about Shia and about Sunnis, generally, from what I've seen on social media, now that may not be a true picture of the entire world, entire Muslim world, but Muslims are saying, you know, shame on you, kind of like if you think that you're identifying someone as Shia and you'd rather them being destroyed by the Zionists. Now, whether that's because of who the enemy is, in the sense where if Iran was fighting a Sunni Muslim country, as an example, maybe you'd say, well, yeah, obviously you're going to side with the Sunni Muslims. So maybe that might not be a true reflection. However, what it has demonstrated, other than a few voices, which we all know who we're talking about, right? We see on social media who have been talking about we can't support the Shia. Actually, what you're doing is you're supporting the Muslim side against the non-Muslim side. But not just that. If you're aware of the Zionist plans for the region, you're going to support Iran regardless, right?
Mhm.
But I think, like you're saying, these are lessons. And another lesson maybe is the fact that the incompetence of the current leadership. These guys have been paying. I'm sure it's one of you guys who said this last time, paying jizya to the Americans for all these years for their protection, right? How futile. Like, you're paying shaitan for protection, and the worst thing is he didn't even protect you in this when the time came. It's like on the day of judgment when you're gonna point towards shaitan and say he told me to do it. He's gonna say, no, I didn't. I just whispered and you did what you had to do, right? In the similar way, he has no power over you, and these guys have demonstrated when it comes down to it, these guys are not going to exert their power for you, against the interests of their actual true allies. So what I'm trying to say is, like, if these are lessons that we're not going to learn in real time, in 8K, in 4K, then it's worrying. And I hope these are discussions that are happening in the Ummah so that we can move forward. You know what I mean? I think that's the main mindset that I'm thinking about.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, another key lesson that we've slightly touched on, but just to kind of highlight is it's not necessarily necessary for us to be superior in terms of military strength compared to our adversaries, enemies, in order to cause harm to our enemies. What I mean by that is Iran's military capability and arsenal it doesn't match the US capability along, joint with the Zionist capability. It doesn't. However, they demonstrated that they can use these Shahid drones and ballistic missiles that cost way less than the THAAD Patriot missiles and the Israeli weaponry and the F-16s that they've been able to damage and cause it's asymmetric, but the proportionality, and again, I'm not saying that Iran wasn't struck, it absolutely was struck, right? And it was damaged and the infrastructure was massively weakened. But what I'm saying is that they were able to still cause damage and a question mark for the Western powers in how they are able to create these ballistic missiles and drones much more frequently. And I've heard that they mentioned they could have carried on this war for 10 years. I don't know how true that is. That's probably a bit of propaganda from their side because, 10 years, that's a long time. But they've said that they can carry on. And I think there's an element of truth to that in that the US thought that they could just target these sites, right, where their military arsenal is, and they would stop. But they didn't stop. And one of the reasons that was mentioned on a podcast I was listening to is that they've created some of these bases in Iran that the entrance is, there. The entrance is there and probably can be identified, but actually it goes underground and there's like a bit of a bunker that if you target the entrance, which they expected to be targeted, because as Rash is saying, they built their systems and their bases based on defending. They're expecting them to be targeted, and they've done it in a way that it goes all the way down, absorbs any attack, and the real base is further down, kind of down, and in a different direction, so that even though these bases were targeted and completely destroyed from the entrance, they will continue to be able to target from these bases. So what does it really show? I think it highlights that, we can be strategic, we can be tactical as a Muslim ummah to be able to cause harm to the enemies. And this is part of our sunnah, this is part of the seerah, in that we can be minority. We can be a weaker force, but we can defeat our adversaries, even if they're large in numbers. Whether that be the Battle of Badr, 313 against 1,000. We had the sincerity, we had the right attitude. As you said, we were proactive. We were prepared for that war, and we were able to defeat our enemies, the Quraysh. When it came to the Battle of Mu'tah, 3,000 Muslims against 100,000, arguably 200,000 of the Romans. Yet the Muslims still won that war. The Romans, fled. Meaning, that is a sunnah. That is part of the seerah. We've seen that Allah tells us in the Quran that if you have that sincerity, if you have the right mentality, then Allah will aid you. And Iran has somewhat demonstrated it from that it can be achieved. But if we have that collective mentality, if these nations did unite together, if Pakistan, Turkey realize that they're next, if they don't be proactive, then if they can come to this, and we as a Muslim Ummah can really recognize this, then we can be more proactive and use these strategic locations, these military resources to our aid to really accelerate the revival, accelerate the return of the Islamic entity, and resume the Islamic way of life. Absolutely, we do need to take these lessons and not just kind of go back to our usual lives, and because the enemy will continue. They won't stop. They did with the genocide. They're continuing there. Lebanon is another genocide that's occurring. Israel is continuing to take more land up into the Litani River and Mount Heron of Syria and other land. They've got a plan, right? So we can't stop. The Muslim Ummah needs to unite and recognize that if they don't, then the Zionists and the enemies will continue with their evil plans.
Maybe it's like, one of the points you mentioned there, and I think probably far more important than that point than that is the mentality itself, because ultimately you have two sides facing each other. One side loves this world, and if they're facing a people who have more desire in the akhirah, then it doesn't matter what technology you have. When it comes down to a war of attrition, only one side is going to win. And I think, the points that you guys have made, the points about Iran, the sanctions, and all of this, maybe there's a blessing, because you look at other countries, they're not under sanctions, but all of their technology and their weapons are brought off the Americans, who can probably flick a switch and nothing works. And the fact that the Iranians have been under sanctions for, all these decades has forced them to improvise, has forced them to, look at ways of getting around to establish defense and stuff like this. Whilst beforehand, I mean, when the Shah was there, I'm sure all the tech was brought off the Americans and so on. So I think when it demonstrates that when you have a people who, okay, we're not talking about an Islamic point of view here, but when you have a people who are united on a revolution mindset, whether it's the Islamic Revolution 1979 Iranian style, right? But nevertheless, you have a people who have a goal and they are willing to sacrifice for that goal. Then, the things about material benefits and stuff like, they don't even come into the equation, because you will achieve and you will make do with what you have if you have to, right? And goes back to what Rash was saying. When you're comfortable, you get lazy in a way. You don't need to do this. So what it shows is that if the Ummah was to have this mindset, and a point that I want to just add, which Rash made on the last podcast, that maybe we want to get to from A to Z straight away. Maybe the next step is that these Muslim countries just say, you know what, we've been played, right? Let's have some sort of a security pact between us, because we're brotherly Muslim nations and we have certain common interests and so on. That comes first. Then, your merger of, just say, your Pakistan, your Turkey, Saudi, and these initiatives, and slowly this takes us to a place where, we think actually we have a common belief, we have a common Sharia. We should all be living according to this, abiding by this, right? You understand? And I think these are the questions that need to probably be discuss now that Muslims shouldn't be looking for their security from the enemies. They should be looking and thinking, well, I'm looking for security in the neighborhood of my own family. Who am I looking to security from? Who is actually the enemy? Why do I need security from the guy who's openly my enemy for the countries who actually, when I actually look into it a bit more, the rifts that we have, these are artificial. These have been created by others. These borders in the sand, they've been put there by someone. You understand? I think these are sort of questions which, as an ummah, we need to have.
And I think that is happening. Like your question you asked earlier about are the Muslims thinking about these things? I think that, when I said earlier about a lot of countries are thinking more independently of what their security needs to be, of what their energy routes need to be. I think the events of this war in the last several years has made more and more countries look at that, and I think that was the point you're referring to in the other podcast is really relevant in that what we see as this stepping stone of where the victory is going to come. We're human beings. We're limited minds. We can't see the bigger picture of where things are going to. Just because we see, oh yeah, the way Islam is going to rise is going to A is going to happen, B, and then these steps. We don't know. But what we're seeing now is it could be that, and we've been seeing it for years, is that the rise of Islam or the rise of kind of Muslim countries to be in a more dominant position, that may be more likely, and it might happen at the same time as the decline of some of these Western powers. And again, we're starting to see that. Whereas maybe several years ago, we couldn't see a vision for what needs to happen in the world. If you just put yourself in a situation, rewind like 10 years, and you go, what needs to happen for the US to collapse as a global superpower? And you said some of the things that have happened in the last year, people think you're crazy. A lot of the things that have happened in the last 10 years are just like, you can't imagine those things happening. So just goes to prove that, we're limited in our thinking. We don't know the effects and the repercussions of things. Obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does. And to link to that point, one point I wanted to make is something I've reflected on more maybe in the last two Ramadans. The verse that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, He hurls the truth at falsehood and it destroys its brains, and his falsehood is destroyed. Yeah. In the past, I used to always just look at that purely from like an Islamic angle, in that it's Islam being thrown at non-Islam. And I know it still is that in a way, but just bear with me a second. I used to just go, okay, that's what we do. So you've got to bring about Islam, and then Islam will come along, and Islam will destroy non-Islam. That kind, like the wrong systems and that. But actually, what you're seeing in the world today is even non-Muslims. There are many, many non-Muslims that are supporting Iran, because they're clearly seeing the aggressor and the liar and the ones that are doing the devastation. And why is it called Epstein Fury rather than Epic Fury? Why? Because even the non-Muslims see this as falsehood, injustice. Put truth and falsehood aside, this is injustice. And when the truth is out there, the truth resonates with everybody, not just with Muslims. You're seeing lots of people going, no, that's wrong what they're doing, or they're just completely lying, they're hiding things. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about the truth and the falsehood, I think it's bigger than just looking at it from an Islamic entity and a non-Islamic entity. It's pure truth, pure justice, pure haqq against the powers of batil that we are seeing that are powerful today.
Hmm.
And you're seeing it played out, like I said, played out in 4K, 8K, whatever you want to see. You're seeing it, and that's why the world opinion is changing towards some of these the powers that have been using colonialist and bully boy tactics for generations now, and people are becoming more and more aware to it, and the information age is aiding that. Obviously, that can have a detrimental effect as well, false news and fake news and AI and whatnot. But the truth generally, for those who are sincere, that comes out on top.
Subhanallah, bro. Nah, fantastic points. I think it's probably a good place to bring the podcast to a close, in all honesty, because it's about vision. Like you said, 10 years ago, would you have thought this? 20 years ago, would you have thought this? So what we're actually seeing is we're seeing like the tectonic plates of geopolitics shifting in real time. And I don't think, and I've been saying this to a lot of people recently. I've been saying, like events like October the 7th, because we're in the here and now. I don't think we can appreciate the shockwaves that these events like that and like Iran has sent across the world to actually aid these tectonic plates to move. And probably only in 20, 30 years you'll be saying, yeah, yeah, yeah. People will be talking about, yeah, this change in the world that happened. I say it goes back to October the 7th, 2023. That's when it started, But whilst we're in the here and now, I don't think we'll be able to appreciate that. And, that was not a very good old Englishman type of
Impression.
impersonation. But guys, listen, um, I think we'll leave it at that, inshallah ta'ala, and we can, get everyone to have a listen, have a think, and mull over what's being said. So, bros, Jazakallah khair for joining me on the podcast, and Jazakallah khair for everyone for tuning in and listening. And like I always say, if you find these episodes beneficial, then please do subscribe and share it with others. And like the guys have said, plenty to think about, but we'll leave it there. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.